Children, I'm a staff of museum section, and which is under the Department of Information, and we organize these talk series to bring awareness on Tibet's history, culture, environment, and most importantly on the human rights situation in Tibet. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Namgyal, and he is born and raised in India. He did his schooling in Tibetan Refugee School, and he did his law degree from Pune, and he also got opportunity to do his LLM in American University, Washington College of Law. And today he will be speaking on United Nations and China, its role and obligation to the United Nations human rights mechanisms. And this session will be, presentation will be for half an hour and will be followed by questions and answers. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Namgyal. Thank you.
Hi, first of all, I want to welcome everyone, and I also want to thank Tibet Museum for inviting me. And first of all, I want to talk a bit about my work that I do in the UN, EU and Human Rights Desk of the Department of Information and International Relations at CTA based in Dharamsala. Basically, our work is to monitor and research on the human rights situations inside Tibet, and more importantly, to report it to the UN Human Rights Council sessions and EU related agencies, and to government foreign ministries through our offices of Tibet. Now, Tibet Museum asked me to speak on the United Nations and any topic that I wanted to speak on. So I chose this topic because China, being a major player in global world affairs these days, and more importantly, China has been for this year, China is not a member of UN Human Rights Council. And also in October, the UPR session that I'll talk more later is coming up for review with regard to China's human rights record. So I thought it's important not only for Tibetans, but also for the everyone to look at China's record and how do they approach the UN, specifically with regard to the UN human rights mechanisms. I guess many of you know the UN, United Nations. After the failure of the League of Nations to prevent the violence and the Second World War, the world order has changed after the Second World War. So many new countries emerged, and many of the major players came together in San Francisco and formulated the Charter of the United Nations, which was signed, and this is the foundational treaty, foundational charter, and formed an international organization that we know as the United Nations in 1945. At that time, 50 of the nations, plus one, that is Poland, which was not present in the meeting, so Poland entered a few months later. So 51 of them got together and signed this treaty and created the United Nations. As of today, we have 193 independent states in the United Nations. And since there was this lack of credibility, lack of efficiency with the League of Nations, and the World War II, the main aim of the United Nations is to maintain peace and international security and respect the human rights. One important thing is the United Nations, to maintain peace and international security, is mostly dealt by the UN General Assembly, and more so by the UN Security Council. And but with regard to the respect and promotion of human rights, the need for another mechanism or system was felt, and so the Commission on Human Rights was set up right after that in 1946. So this is actually the key moments in the history of international human rights law, how it emerged. Then we have this Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Then we have General Assembly Resolution 1514, which is important in the sense that it was a declaration for the forming of independent nations from the colonial era, out of the colonial period. And then we have this another treaty, International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1965. And then we have International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and another important one is international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. So I won't go into deep because it's very technical in a sense, and we will touch more on the Chinese version, how they perceive it. And then we also have the General Assembly Resolution 2625, because it is important because it's the most important international, we call it International Bill of Rights. It's basically the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a declaration which has no binding obligations on the states. So, the creation of international civil and political rights and international covenant on Universal Declaration of Human Rights, two treaties were created. Now, now I'll talk more with regard to the treaty-based mechanism. These are treaties, that means those states who sign and ratifies as enforceable unless the state parties ratifies it. And then we have regional mechanisms. Unfortunately, Asia doesn't have a sound regional mechanism, whereas Americas, Europe, and even Africa has a good, it's developing in the Africa. We have America's Commission on Human Rights and European Commission on Human Rights. We even have very functional European Court of Human Rights. Now, just to give you a brief overview of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, as I've talked about UN Commission on Human Rights, it was set up in 1946, but there were so many instances where the gross violators of human rights became the member state of the UN Commission on Human Rights, and more so sometimes became the president of the UN Human Commission. Assembly felt the need to change the UN Commission on Human Rights and set up a new body which is called the UN Human Rights Council. And it was established in March 2006 by the General Assembly to replace the UN Commission on Human Rights. And it has presently 47 member states. And earlier, gross violators cannot be removed from the UN Commission on Human Rights, but now gross violators can be removed by two-thirds majority of General Assembly. And its main aim is to promote, coordinate, monitor, and mainstream human rights internationally and within the UN system. Now, for an average human being, average citizen around the world, if they have any grievances against the state policy or any related to human rights abuses, the first approach towards the UN basically is towards the UN Human Rights Council. So, under the UN Human Rights Council, we have special procedures, which is very important, and another mechanism which evolved recently is universal periodic review that I'll talk a bit later. Now, under the special procedures, now we have two bodies, in the sense one is country mandates and thematic mandates. Now, country mandates are basically you appoint an independent expert based on the situation within a country. For example, you appoint a special rapporteur on the case of Sudan or Sri Lanka. It depends. Whereas thematic mandates is based on the theme around the world. For example, we have 8 on civil and political rights. For example, we have a special rapporteur on torture, special rapporteur on summary executions, likewise freedom of expression. And also, we have 8 on economic, social, and cultural rights. Again, it has been divided within the civil and political rights and economic and social and cultural rights. And we have 9 on specific groups. And also we have another working group, independent experts working on specific area of concern, like arbitrary detention, enforcing involuntary disappearances, mercenaries, and African descent. Now, next is what's the role of the special procedures. For example, if there's to implement its mechanisms, but it's also the part of the member states to receive the visits, because and at the end of the day, if, for example, special rapporteur on torture wanted to visit China, if China doesn't welcome it or invite the rapporteur, he cannot do so. So, if countries have all the 193 member states and question China and have accountable to any of the human rights abuses within the China. And you obviously High Commission of Human Rights, other relevant stakeholders like NGOs, National Human Rights Institutions. For example, NGOs here is the NGOs, there's a criteria for the NGOs to submit questionnaires or reports inside Tibet has worse than management. Now, China's role and obligation in the UN system. Interestingly, China was one of the founding members of the United Nations, but at that time it was technically represented by the Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China and the present-day Taiwan. And till 1971, the Republic of China, the Taiwan has taken the seat of China, represented by China. But in 1971, UN General Assembly